The cost of childcare is insane.
It's crazy. The cost of daycare has skyrocketed.
It's as much as a mortgage in most states. And you're like, is my child getting a PhD?
Don't allow this back of the napkin math to force you out of the workforce. You can be smart about it. You can be strategic about it. You can change the plan.
It's really important when you decide to have a kid to start doing research and understanding how all the different options work and how do you choose what's best for your family. That's what we're talking about today. First up, we're talking to Corinne Low. Corinne is an economist at the Wharton School of Business. She wrote this great book, Having It All, where she reframes the cost of childcare and what it really means to spend all this money. You're not just throwing away money. It's an investment in your time, in your career, in your family. And when you begin to look at it that way, you feel better about it. It can be so empowering to shift that narrative from it being a cost burden on the mom to being a family expense that everyone benefits from. I'm Lindsey Stanberry, and this is Family Money. I've been interviewing people about their money stories for more than a decade, and I've been a mom for just about as long. Needless to say, I have lots of thoughts on kids and money.
You really talk about how women tend to feel uncomfortable talking about money. Yeah. Why do you think that is?
It's scary, right? I hear from people who want to have kids all the time. How do you actually afford to have a kid? But that's why we're here. That's what we're doing with Family Money. We're offering you advice and tips and tricks, and you're going to hear from amazing experts to help put you at ease. Welcome to Family Money. I'd love to talk with you about the cost of childcare, which is really overwhelming. Why are we seeing childcare costs increase so much?
There's a lot of forces right now that are driving that. I mean, one is just inflation in general. Yeah. One is the shortages that we had coming out of the pandemic. And then there were some subsidies in the pandemic that are now expiring. And so really have been putting the squeeze on parents. But there's actually a longer term trend at play, which is that the cost of childcare has long been outpacing inflation. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is that it's not an apples to apples comparison in terms of what you're getting, is that the quality of childcare and the standards for quality childcare have actually increased a lot over time. Mm-hmm. So if you go back to the 1980s, it was perfectly acceptable to have 20, 30 kids, babies in their little cribs, and you hand them bottles assembly line style. It was perfectly acceptable to have the toddlers in front of the TV at the daycare center.
That was my upbringing, was sitting in front of Mrs. Weddle's TV watching Sesame Street.
And exactly, that's a lot cheaper because it's much less hands-on, right? Whereas if you think about the childcare that we want for our children right now, but in fact is actually the regulatory standard in many states, right? It's that 4-to-1 infant to caregiver ratio. It's the hands-on care. It's not having screens, right? Yeah. It's, active outdoor time, and that's more expensive to provide. So the product itself has actually changed, but the problem is that doesn't create a lot of options for parents who maybe don't earn enough to cover that enormous cost.
One thing that I think is really interesting is this idea of childcare deserts, especially in rural communities where there just isn't that infrastructure. How does that impact pricing and what parents are doing?
Those childcare deserts, it's those parents that then are being left without options. Some of those families are saying well, we don't really have a good option, an option we feel comfortable with.
Right.
So does it make sense for mom just to stay home? And then the other force is the fall in intergenerational households and the generations spreading out, where we go from having grandparents as people who are nearby and providing care to often they're far away, but now generations spread out, grandparents need care, right? Yeah. Rather than providing the input of care.
It's interesting. My grandparents lived far away when I was growing up, but my parents live here now and are very actively involved.
You are so blessed.
I know. I am so lucky. And I often think it's my mom. It's like she's responding to the struggle that she had. Yeah. She saw how hard it was for her. That's why we were always at Mrs. Weddle's house. I'm curious, one kid, expensive. 2 kids, very expensive.
Mm-hmm. When you're adding additional kids, you have to think about what costs are going to scale and what costs aren't going to scale. And then you also have to think about timing and child spacing with your budget, right? Mm-hmm. Because if you live someplace that has universal pre-K, right, then you've just got 3 years that you've got to get through. So do you actually want to have that 3-year child spacing so you're getting one set of daycare fees off your budget before another one comes in? Yeah. Or do you want to consider, a form of childcare that might be too expensive when you have just one kid, but that the cost doesn't scale when you add a second kid. And so I think you have to start thinking about potentially different solutions when you're thinking about multiple kids instead of just one, or you really think about the timing so that you're able to not have both of those hitting at the same time. But even if you do hit that crunch where you have 1 year where you have 2 daycare fees at the same time, and then you say, well, this is more than my salary. Should I even be working? Yeah. That is the wrong math, okay? Because that is 1 year. And if you step outside the labor force, right, the loss of the investment in your human capital is going to add up to way more than just your salary in that single year, right?
Yeah.
So I think we have to understand the same way like when a kid goes to college, and if you have 2 kids who are in college at the same time, and you're like, this is impossible, but it's time bound, right?
Yeah.
So if you happen to have daycare that you have to pay for 2 kids, in a single year, what can you do to pull resources into that period, right?
Yeah.
So you hold off on upgrading the car. But I think the key thing is thinking about your financial planning over a longer time horizon.
Yeah.
And so I am not in favor of like high interest consumer debt. I'm going to be the scoldy economist.
No.
Is going to say,
Same.
we need like no credit card debt. Like that is, and also you have to be maxing out your 401k match because that's free money. But once you're doing that, once you don't have the credit card debt and once you're maxing out your 401k match, now when you're in this period that I call the squeeze, where your kids are young and they're expensive in both time and money, it's okay to do other things that aren't how you want to live long term to get through this period.
Right.
So if you don't save a single cent other than your 401k match when you have kids who are daycare aged, I'm fine with that. I'm not going to scold you about that, right? If you finance, but at low interest rates, some things that you typically wouldn't want to finance, some larger purchases like home improvements. Again, I'm fine with that, right?
Yeah.
Because this period passes. But you've got to make sure to get back on that financial wagon when your youngest kid goes to pre-K or kindergarten. Whenever you stop paying for childcare, I want you to put that date on your calendar, and that's the start saving and start investing again date, okay? So you have a date with yourself to get your house back in order, because the issue is it often becomes like a slippery slope where you're like, okay, we took debt to do this, and now we're just going to kind of keep doing that. So it is a limited period of time, but you've got to hold it to that limited period.
You do such a good job of talking about this, about childcare being an investment in your future self. And then a lot of other things that I think parents need, which is like home help and even small things like grocery delivery, that those kinds of investments and reframing it as not a waste of money, but like something that really is helpful.
I think you said it exactly right. It's like it is an investment in your human capital, because the time that you're able to spend on your career, that's building what economists call your permanent income, which is that we think about everything you're able to earn over your entire lifetime, not just in this moment. And so I tell people to reframe outsourcing a little bit as if you're not outsourcing something, you are hiring yourself to do it, and asking if in this moment, does it make sense to hire yourself for that job? And if you're at an inflection point in your career, you should not be hiring yourself for extra jobs around the house.
Order the groceries.
Yes. And I also point out to people that families take their car to the mechanic to get the oil changed, because we don't think twice, we don't blink when it's a male-coded task that we need to outsource. But when it's a female-coded task, then comes the guilt and the feeling that we should just be able to do it ourselves.
Yeah. That's amazing. I think that's a great place to stop. Corinne, this has been so lovely. It's so much fun to chat with you about all these things, and I cannot recommend your book enough. It's so fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back. Corinne did a really wonderful job giving us a big picture overview of just how expensive childcare is and how we need to reframe it as an investment. But you have to pay for it, right? You have to choose it. So I invited my friend Farnoosh Torabi, who's a financial expert, to really walk us through all the different kinds of childcare available, what it costs, and how to decide what's available to you and what you want to spend your money on. And we're back. Hi, Farnoosh. So happy to have you here today.
Hi, Lindsey. It's so great to be here.
Could we kind of walk through the different kinds of childcare options?
Sure. So daycare centers are a very popular option. A lot of families opt into this. So depending on where you live, it can be anywhere from $1,500 to $2,500 a month. From there, it could be an at-home daycare center where there might be more flexibility. It's anywhere from 10 to 30% more affordable. But in some cases, those facilities may not be as certified. Maybe it's like a trusted neighbor, a family member, perhaps perhaps who's running a business.
Yeah.
And then there are options like parents and grandparents.
Yes.
That's at maybe the free level. Between the daycare center and the free level, there's also nannies and at-home caregivers, right? That's actually the premium,
That's
right?
the premium,
That's
right?
the premium.
You get a nanny, but then there's nanny shares.
Absolutely.
Which introduces a whole set of different challenges and financial opportunities.
Absolutely. I've heard of this in cities. It's for people who have vertical living. It's very convenient. People on your floor or in your building to share an at-home caregiver. It's not always simple, but it's always trade-offs. It's always trade-offs. But the cost of an at-home caregiver can be anywhere from $20 to $35 an hour per child.
Right.
Of course, you also have to consider things like overtime.
Right. When you have a nanny, it's like you're hiring an employee.
Right. There's another option, which is au pair, which sounds very fancy. When I was growing up, it's sort of like I thought it was reserved just for the elite and the rich people. But, I have several friends who choose this option. And what it is essentially is hiring through an agency a young adult. Someone who's usually 18 to 25 years old. They live overseas. They're looking for an American cultural experience.
Right.
They come and live with you for usually up to 2 years.
Wow.
More like as a mother's helper, a family helper.
Yeah.
They make about $200 a week stipend.
Okay.
The catch is, of course, you have to have a comfortable place for them to stay in your home.
Yes.
A dedicated space.
Right.
You're providing lodging and food. Sometimes you need to give them access to your car, right? To be able to take your kids around. And they need, and they work strict, 35, 40 hours a week, right? You have to give them the time off to do other things.
They're not on call all the time for you.
Exactly. So that works for some families.
Sure.
It doesn't for others. So there's a spectrum of options, a spectrum of affordable options.
Right.
And then, of course, there's parents who give up their careers and their jobs temporarily or forever to be home with their families.
Yeah. So, I mean, it feels like every option sort of has its pros and cons, its costs, the good and the bad. With a nanny, with an au pair, you're inviting them into your home. The daycare center. I remember dropping my son off when he was a baby. We used a really lovely in-home daycare center, but that first day was just, I think, like one of the worst days of my life. Walking away, and it felt like he was with strangers, and he was so tiny.
Yeah.
But in the end, the last day, when it was his last day in the daycare center, and I cried like I was losing like a best friend because we had grown so close to them. So choosing that is like a really big deal.
Yeah. And I would say other things to consider when you're choosing, let's say, a daycare center is to ask them about turnover rate.
That's a good one.
How often are families coming and going? How flexible are you? What happens if my kid gets sick? What happens if I'm running late from work? What if I need to do an early drop off? Because for families, we know flexibility, time is everything sometimes in that first year.
It really is. And the time money question pops up all the time when you become a parent who works outside the home.
Exactly.
Even a parent who works inside the home.
For sure.
It's a lot. It's a lot. Let's talk a little bit about nannies, and because it's complicated, right? It's not about Venmoing them at the end of the week. There's often rules and laws around how you pay them and if you're paying them Social Security and benefits. And I've followed so many chains where the nanny gets sick and needs surgery, and then you're paying for a nanny and a backup nanny because they need healthcare benefits. So I'm just curious, what are all the different things that people should consider?
Right. You're an employer, essentially, and this person is working in your home.
Yes.
And this person is taking care of your most precious person.
Most important.
Right? And so let's think about that. Let's sort of sit with that. Okay. I think that's really important for families to sort of lead with that in mind and set up an infrastructure that supports that for everybody. And with that, I think it's really important to set up a financial system that supports the household and the employee, the nanny.
Yeah.
So we use an online payroll service. There are many of them. In the long run, the cost is not big, for what they provide.
Right.
It's automatic W-2 statements at the end of the year, which allows the nanny to file their taxes quite simply. And for you also to have that documentation for your tax visit. They also will deduct out of that their Medicare and their Social Security and all the appropriate taxes. Yeah. So Do you want to do that?
No, I do not.
Be my guest. I don't want to do that stuff. So the payroll services takes care of that. It's the cost, again, is nominal compared to the time that it saves you, the stress, and ultimately it's work, right? That you don't have to do.
Yeah.
I would also say that the costs that you want to consider as well, the ancillary costs, right? It's not just the hourly wage. There's also overtime. You're paying for their vacation, their PTO.
Right.
And you want to have a backup plan, right? In the event that they do need to have a surgery or they want to take an extra vacation or life happens.
It does.
And I remember one year our caregiver, she won an award and it was going to be overseas.
Oh my goodness.
And she'd already used up her PTO. Like, am I going to get in the way of her going overseas? You know, of course not, right?
Yeah.
And again, this goes back to this person becomes sort of part of your family.
Yeah.
I think not all households view it that way. And I wish they would, because the more you do, I think the better the relationship runs for everybody.
Yeah, definitely.
That's my POV.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we were talking a little bit about taxes. There's FSA dependent care, which sort of takes a little bit of the edge off.
So essentially, these are provided through your employer. It's an account where annually you can take about $5,000 pre-tax.
Right.
It's deducted from your taxable income. You throw it into this account, and you can use it for childcare expenses.
Right.
It's kind of a use it or lose it in some cases.
It is.
Kind of have to read your guidelines with your employer. And to your point, it kind of takes a little bit of the burden off.
Yeah.
It's
not a cure-all.
not
right?
a cure-all. But hey, if it's offered, I would just sort of ahead of time be aware of what your costs are.
Yeah.
You know, don't max it out if you don't have to, because then you might lose that money.
Yeah, we used it to pay for summer camps.
Yeah, summer camps count. Obviously, daycare, all sorts of care.
Yes. What financial mistakes have you seen people make when setting up childcare?
Well, I think it is not first having a conversation with your partner about how can we as a household optimize our time and our schedules so that we can then go and figure out what puzzle pieces we need to outsource and pay for via childcare.
Right.
Instead of what a lot of couples do, which is like, I'm working these hours before the baby comes and you're working these hours before the baby comes, heretofore.
Yeah.
We need to find all of this childcare
Yes.
and look, that may still be the case once your child arrives, but we don't even stop to think that maybe our employer is willing to be more flexible with us once our family grows, and we can say, hey, could we have more work from home time?
Yes.
Could we adjust our daytime hours? Could I go to work later in the morning and come home? You know, so my husband and I, for example, when we first had our son, we hired a nanny and she was working 8 hours a day, which actually isn't a lot.
It's not.
It turns out.
Not,
I thought that I was like, 40 hours a week. That's fantastic.
No,
and turns out you work more than 8 hours a day. So 8 to 4 was the schedule. And I didn't really get my day going until 10. And I would sort of be working until 6. And then my husband would leave around 9 and get home around 5. And my nanny was out the door by 4. So I was left with a baby at 4 o'clock, but still had maybe phone calls and, you know, all sorts of things. So about 3 months into that, I had a conversation with my husband. And I was like, look, is there a way where you could come home at 4 and the nanny leaves at 4? So you and I can kind of strategize at that time to figure out who is going to caregive.
Right.
Maybe it is me, maybe it is you, but it's always me every day right now. And it's kind of taking from my ability to finish work. And then I'm silly to think that at 8 o'clock when we put him down that I can go back to work. So he went to his job and asked, hey, could I come into work even earlier and leave earlier? And they said, sure. So that allowed us to not have to get extra childcare, rather just adjust his hours so that we could be home together and sort of tag team with the baby.
Yeah, the tag teaming and the communication is so key, isn't it?
It's so key.
Can we talk about one of my big money pet peeves? This idea that it's the mother's income that covers the childcare.
Oh my God. I like to think of it as the household income.
Me too.
It's unfair. It's essentially saying that the entirety of child rearing and child caring is a mother's responsibility.
Right.
Whenever I would have this conversation with women, it was interesting. I would talk to women out at school events, school functions, or out and about, women who were no longer working.
Yes.
And they would say, I did the math and my salary was barely covering childcare, or it was a little bit more. It would almost always be followed up with the following: I didn't really like my job anyway.
Yes.
So it made me wonder, maybe we should start pursuing careers that we really, really like.
Right.
Also, we sometimes start to opt out once we start to even think about having a family.
Yeah.
We think, oh, well, having a family and having a professional life, it's really difficult to have those two. Sort of psychologically, we start to undermine our ability in the workplace. We don't go for the promotion.
Right.
We don't job hop.
Right.
We don't ask for the raise because we're like, we just defer to this idea of like, well, eventually I'll probably just have to be the full-time caregiver. Because what I'm making now will probably stay the same. And I'll probably end up just having to quit.
That's an interesting way to think about it. I've heard it from women and I've heard it from men. My wife doesn't make enough money. And I'm like, do you make enough money to afford the home that you live in?
Exactly.
Like, I just think that there's other expenses that are considered.
Because childcare supports everybody.
Everybody.
Childcare is an investment.
Yes.
I mean, I'll go even so far to say that it is an investment like your student loans are an investment. We are willing to go into 6 figures worth of debt for a bachelor's degree, for a job that we're not even going to get. But we are not willing to hire someone or go and drop our child off at a daycare facility.
Right.
So that we can continue working.
Yeah.
So that we can someday collect Social Security. So that we can contribute to a 401k.
Right.
So that we can continue, earning our place in the workforce, earning a paycheck.
Yeah.
Continuing our trajectory. And I mean, if that's what you want to do, I'm not saying you have to. There's nothing wrong with stepping out of the workforce.
No.
I'm just saying that don't allow this back of the napkin math that is genderist to force you out of the workforce.
Yes, I think that's the thing. Is to consider it as a family expense, the big picture. Right. It doesn't all have to be shouldered on one person.
Yeah.
How should people think about the trade-off? You were talking a little bit about, the nanny, this like cost versus flexibility, it being an investment. The more flexible is arguably the more expensive.
Right. Look, I mean, it's easy to say that investing in your flexibility is a payoff and, investing is good, but money costs. Yeah. And I don't want to sit here and say, just always invest if it's going to afford you flexibility. Yeah. And because flexibility is a good thing and time is important. Everybody has a ceiling. So do what you can and prioritize what's important. Maybe start with baby steps. I think it's always nice to have a goal, maybe. Like maybe the first 6 months we're going to start out with this sort of an arrangement for childcare, but our goal is to eventually hire someone full-time to come into the home because eventually I want to go back into the workforce full-time, and that is what is going to satisfy and support that. And that's what I want families to really remember is that we make a plan and we can change the plan. Yeah. We don't have to create this forever plan for childcare. Yeah. It's malleable.
I think that's so important about childcare is that it's always changing. You're always sort of reinventing the wheel on it. And that's a good thing.
It's a good thing. And your time is valuable, but also your time with your kid is valuable too. This rush back to the workforce, I know some of us do have that pull. And if that's your calling, go for it. It's a very individual thing.
It is. It's so great to see more and more companies offering paternity leave. I have so many friends who have sort of split that time where the mom will stay home at first for 3 or 4 months, and then the husband will step in and have his opportunity. And, that creates a bond with them and saves money on childcare. And I think just makes a good system for people.
Yeah, my husband, we're going back 10 years. So I know things have, in the more recent years, have accelerated in that department. But even 10 years ago, we assumed there was no paternity leave. Yeah. At a startup, no less. Right. And my husband went and just because, ask, you never know. No. And they said, we have 4 weeks of paid leave for fathers. Yeah. And so he did stagger it. And we were so blown away by that.
Yeah,
so if that was the case back then for a startup, imagine what could be possible today for even like a small company that's not at the seed level.
No,
No,
it was the same. My husband had 4 weeks and took 2 weeks at the beginning and 2 weeks at the end. We were so excited.
Yeah.
But I think
take what you can get.
I feel so lucky for people who have, 3 to 6 months. It's so nice.
Yeah, take it.
Do you see areas where people can save money on this? I feel like people always get a little funny about like saving money on childcare. Is it even possible?
Well, you mentioned earlier pairing up with another household.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Leaning on your community, leaning on the generosity of neighbors and friends, seeking the advice and counsel of other parents. I'm not going to say that it's like something that you can do all the time, but for moments when you're in a bind, you have a job interview and you want to go and do it, or someone's sick in your family and you have to go help them and you have a gap in childcare.
Yeah.
The idea that you have to go pay for a service or pay, out of pocket for that. Maybe there is someone in your neighborhood, a neighbor, someone you can trust to come in and help.
Yeah.
And building those relationships before your kids are even born, if you're expecting, really, really helpful. But even in those early months when you are home with your kid, baby, that's a great way to invest your time, is to get to know other early stage parents for these times, especially to really help each other out in crisis moments. But I think in general, if you're comfortable pairing up with other families to share in that childcare expense,
it can be so
50% less.
Yeah.
What's better than that?
Yeah. I was always so reluctant to like share advice as if there wasn't enough. Like you don't want to let somebody in on your secret affordable childcare or something like that. And as I've gotten to be an older parent, I'm like, no, let me share. Let's swap stories.
Oh, drop that scarcity mindset.
Yes,
it's good. It's okay.
definitely.
I will say too, there is a movement of people going back to live in their hometowns.
Yeah.
Or inviting an in-law or a grandparent to come and stay with them in the early months. I mean, my friends just bought a home. They're younger and they haven't started, growing their family yet, but they had in mind, we want an additional bedroom for potentially like an in-law in the event that we will need childcare. And this is a couple that almost didn't have a kid, didn't even think that it was possible because they did the math.
Yeah.
They did the spreadsheet and they're like, oh my gosh, childcare, whoa. And they thought, well, we have healthy parents who would love to spend time with their future grandkids maybe. And, it's a bit of a consideration. But these are the trade-offs that families are making right now.
My mom helped, did not live with us, but helped a lot. And I like to tease her that there's no such thing as free childcare. I definitely paid in other ways.
Here's the other thing people should know. It's temporary.
Yeah. It is.
Can we just say that?
That's the big thing,
it's a temporary investment.
Yes. It's just a short period of time.
And it does pay off in many cases, right?
Yeah.
It's short-term, medium-term, and long-term payoff.
Yeah.
Not to say throw all the money at it.
No.
Be blind about it. But, you can be smart about it. You can be strategic about it. You can change the plan. There are ways to save. But this idea that it's just too expensive and this is the reason I'm not going to have a child, which is sort of also another, I've seen this kind of quick math. It's very fearful.
Yes.
There's a lot of fear around this. Understandably, it's a big number, but I hope, we're trying to explain that there are many ways to slice and dice it.
There are definitely different ways. And I think it takes some digging and some better understanding of your finances. And as we were talking about earlier, like what you do as a dual income couple with no kids and what you do as a dual income couple with kids is dramatically different. Your budget just changes because you have a child now.
Right. I always say people often think having a child is like adding this additional expense to their existing budget.
Yeah.
And they go, whoa. I'm paycheck to paycheck as it is.
Yeah.
As opposed to what it really is, which is you're going to ground zero with your budget.
Yes.
You are rebuilding the budget with your child at the heart of it. And everything else is like dancing around this kid. So, those date nights on Monday through Friday.
Your very fancy gym membership, not as important anymore.
I hope you'll get back to that.
Yeah.
And you'll do that occasionally.
Yes.
But your lifestyle will change. and your priorities will shift. And guess what? You'll be happy to do it because kids will change your life in a beautiful way.
Yeah.
And this is not just hyperbole.
No.
Like, we are telling you this because people told us this, right?
Yeah.
We were like, okay.
Yeah. Yes.
And then here we are telling an audience
It's the same thing.
Circle of life.
It is.
You know?
Farnoosh, this was so much fun. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Lindsey. I'm so happy to talk about this anytime.
I don't want you to feel overwhelmed by everything that we just covered because it was a lot. So if you have questions, feel free to DM us on Instagram or TikTok. If you love Family Money, make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.